Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. I'm here today with David Barash, who is an emeritus professor of psychology and I think evolutionary biology at University of Washington, also the author of numerous books. You just informed me that you have a textbook, which I was unaware of, but I do have quite a few of your more popular books. I think that the latest book is called Oops, the Worst Blunders of All Time. But I've also got Through a Glass Brightly, Using Science to See Our Species as We Really Are. One that came out, I think, a couple years ago called Threats, Intimidation and Its Discontents. We've got Out of Eden, The Surprising Consequences of Polygamy. Homo Mysterious, Evolutionary Puzzles of Human Nature. Survival Game, it's all about game theory. Natural Selections, all about liars and altruists. And then a couple of fun books, one called Madame Bovary's Ovaries, a Darwinian look at literature, co-authored with your daughter, and How Women Got Their Curves and Other Just So Stories, a book co-authored with your wife. So it's a bit of a family affair. Welcome, David.
Hi, Greg. Happy to be here.
Well, look, I mean, your work covers a large amount of ground, but the themes that run through your work are all about what we might think of as human nature, loosely applied. And some of the other themes that I found interesting is you spend a lot of time on what we might call biophobia, right? Which is a kind of a general aversion to some of the insights and consequences from evolution and biology, which within the field of evolution biology are non-controversial and fairly well understood, but which in the social sciences and the humanities are looked at with some skepticism and doubt. And then also, I think you're trying to challenge the notion of human centrality and uniqueness, and to position humans within the natural world. So I was wondering, maybe we could start off by just talking about this notion of biophobia. Why is it that you suppose that disciplines like psychology and sociology and anthropology are averse to looking at what we might call human nature?
Well, that's a really important question, Greg, and I'm very glad you raised it. There are actually two aspects of biophobia. The first, and I guess the one we'll talk about first because he raised it, is why are so many people in the social sciences biophobic? We should also talk about why so many people outside of just normal people, if you will, non-academics, are often biophobic as well, because I think the reasons are not quite the same. If we look within the academy, there's virtually no biophobia among natural scientists, and for good reason. We are biological creatures. Pretty much anyone who's trained as a scientist recognizes that, and that's really not debatable or even controversial. But it is still controversial in many areas of the social sciences, and I think there are a few reasons for this. One is that in reality, the unfortunate truth is that evolutionary biology in the past has been misused, especially fairly shortly after Darwin, the whole time of social Darwinism, at which time particularly right-wing zealots and supporters of imperialism and colonialism were intrigued by the notion that somehow, and it was really a misunderstanding of evolutionary biology, but they loved the idea that because of evolution, certain people, notably the white races, were superior, that they were produced that way by natural forces, and hence it is within it's appropriate for them to go ahead and conquer the world, conquer as many people as they can, And moreover, not just with regard to colonialism, but also with regard to the way things are at home. The wealthy are wealthy because they were biologically made superior, and we shouldn't argue with that. So there was that, and that's very much a misunderstanding of evolution and how it works. But to some extent, I think biologists are still struggling against that misapprehension. And there are many in the social sciences who still hold that against biology, the fact that it was misused. And there is some risk of it being misused all the time, I think, even now. So there's that. Beyond that, even within the, or particularly within the social sciences, there's another factor. It's actually quite different, which is that the social sciences have long been committed to the role of culture, social learning, various experiential effects in influencing behavior. And biologists, such as myself and others, don't argue with that. But we also argue that human behavior is not simply a result of experience and culture. And so there's a bit of a problem here that was that I think it was Max Planck, the great physicist, who said science progresses from one funeral to the next. Namely, just like so many fields, once people are committed to a particular perspective, it's very hard for them to change. And the great majority of people trained in the social sciences were, and to some extent even now, are trained to say that their approach to the world, their paradigm is the only valid one, and that anything that reeks of biology, of evolution, of even the hint of genetics, is to be excoriated. And so people often have a really hard time adjusting their worldview. So I think if you add those two things together, one is the misuse of evolution in the past, and among some individuals even now, and you add to that the extreme conservatism, if you will, among most people, really, and in this case we're talking about those trained in the social sciences, real hesitation to go against the training that they've had all along. So I think those two factors are the main reasons why within the social sciences, biology has had a hard time. I should add that that is changing, and it's changing fairly rapidly. Nonetheless, I think Planck was to some extent right. I mean, it's really hard to change your opinion. It's much easier to change your shirt, right? I mean, to change a deeply held worldview is really challenging, and it is happening, but it's happening slowly. Let me add, I don't want to monopolize here, but there is the other question about the difficulty of the existence of biophobia outside of the academy. With regard to evolution now specifically, I think this is particularly the case for people who hold a sort of a semi-fundamentalist religious view. And those people, not surprisingly, are resistant to the notion that human beings are animals. I was going to say like other animals. We're not really like no animal is like another animal. Each species is unique in its own way, and we are too. But people who hold fundamentalist or even semi-fundamentalist views have a very hard time accepting that. And the notion that human beings are cut from the same cloth as other living things is an extremely difficult thing for many, many people to accept. We could go on in that, but I think those are the two main legs, if you will, of biophobia. And to some extent, they still exist today.
Well, I mean, it is kind of strange that, we all know the Scopes monkey trial, and it was at one point the conservatives who were the ones, and the religious people who were the ones who were most suspicious of the insights of evolution. It seems now that it's actually widespread among more highly educated people, this notion of human uniqueness, right? So the great chain of being, and humans sitting at the top and having this unique capacity to transcend biology. I mean, that seems to be almost mainstream ideology among the people who are the least religious, or is it just a new kind of religiosity that we find among educated people?
Well, I think the reality, Greg, is that you find a whole variety at this point. I mean, there are very conservative people who the ones who are most fundamentalist inclined are still the ones who are the most
Mhm.
opposed. There's really no
Yeah.
question about that. Um, it's interesting that among many advocates on the left, particularly the far left, also are very skeptical, not because they believe that human beings are formed in the image of God and chips off the old divine block, but rather they're still concerned about the misuse of evolutionary
Hmm.
biology. And my good friend, but often opponent, Steve Gould was among these. Stephen Jay Gould was a really an excellent evolutionary biologist. Um, and his politics were actually not that far from mine. He was a Marxist, an admitted,
Hmm.
outspoken Marxist. I've never really been a Marxist, but I'm much more sympathetic to socialism. In fact, I would happily describe myself as a democratic socialist, if you will, in the mold of Bernie Sanders. Um, But Steve felt really strongly about the potential misuse of biology when it came to human behavior. And he was quite outspoken, and I really think quite wrong, in claiming that evolutionary biology had very little to do with human behavior. He accepted that it had a lot, essentially everything, to do with human evolution. And that's true for most intelligent, educated people. But when it came to behavior, he and many on the left, especially, have been and continue to be skeptical. And I think it's because, again, of the really two factors. One is the misuse in the past, the notion, as David Hume talked about long ago, that is implies ought, that the way things are, the way they ought to be and should be, and that this was used, and worry that it's still going to be used to justify social inequality, essentially. Um, and so it's an odd thing that you get devotees of the relatively far right and the relatively far left who more or less come together when it comes to discomfort with applying evolution to human behavior. And of course, on the far right, it's a discomfort with a far fundamentalist religious right applying evolution even to our basic evolution of our anatomy and physiology, and not just our behavior.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like one of the big problems is that people fall into this naturalistic fallacy, right? And it seems like they're less willing to abandon that than they are willing to abandon science, right? I mean, it would seem,
Yep.
a whole lot easier just to abandon the notion that natural implies good, right? I mean, that's a whole lot easier to abandon than to sort of, ignore centuries of scientific insight.
That's very well put. Absolutely true. You know, at some level, I think we all, in fact, I know we all abandon the naturalistic fallacy that the way things are means that they're necessarily good. I mean, entropy, second law of thermodynamics, is very well established, right? Does that mean that you shouldn't clean up your room because it's good when things get messy?
I'm
I
sure
mean,
some kids will use that argument. I bet that there's kids out there
right.
that once they learn about thermodynamics, they're going to bring that home.
That's right. Entropy is good, or entropy is natural, hence it's good. Hence, we shouldn't fight against it. Similarly,
Mhm.
gravity. I mean, does that mean we should all crawl on our bellies because it takes it takes effort to go against gravity, which is about as natural as things get? So clearly, the fact that something is natural doesn't mean that it's good, or that we have to succumb to it or go along with it necessarily. And there may be any number of things. I, I, I don't usually get very angry. I never, to my knowledge, have ever even hit anyone in anger, really. But I've sometimes felt inclined. I felt angry enough that I could, but that doesn't mean that I should.
Mhm.
There are all sorts of feelings that one may have that may be quote natural. That doesn't mean we have to go along with it. And by the same token, The differences that we observe in various human societies or between various individuals within society. The fact that it exists even doesn't necessarily mean that that's natural. It's a consequence of any number of things. And even if it was natural, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. But you and I agree, to my regret, and probably our regret, there are an awful lot of people who still seem really stubbornly, as you say, they're more willing to succumb to give up on science than they are to give up on this weird notion that is implies ought.
Well, I mean, it seems like even biologists get, I think, a bit of a positive feeling and thrill when they observe the good side of human nature, right? When we see cooperation and when we see charitable behavior and we see kindness, we're like more inclined to say, yeah, there we go. That's humanity at work. Like, we want to think of ourselves more like the bonobos or the mythical bonobos and less like the chimpanzees, right? Even biologists will succumb to this affinity to the good side of our nature
Sure.
and kind of downplay the bad side.
Well, I think it's not universally true though. I mean, it's certainly true for me. I love it when I see quote nice things happening. Your
Uh-huh.
heart swells when you see a baby being cared for by a parent, whether it's a
Mm-hmm.
human or a non-human parent. Just as we love to see sunrises and rainbows. On the other hand, many biologists, and to some extent myself as well, when I was doing field work, and I think this is more true of men than of women, um, are more likely to be intrigued when they see acts of violence. They're more likely to study and pay attention to sort of eye catching and emotion generating activity that isn't only heartwarming. Predation. I mean, you look at nature films. I love so many of the nature films, particularly those by David Attenborough and lots of others. But the truth is, there's a special propensity to show predation and animal fights, and so it's not just the heartwarming stuff. It's the nature red in tooth and claw from Tennyson, which is a misrepresentation of most of what goes on in nature. But let's face it, most people pay more attention, I suspect, pay more attention to the blood and guts. And as an evolutionary biologist, I would suggest that there's unfortunately, but real good reason for that, which is those events that involve violence are the ones, even they may be rare, and in fact, they almost always are relatively rare, but when they occur, they're pretty damn important. And it is important that we pay attention to them. I mean, not unlike in some ways rubbernecking at an automobile accident. You know,
Yeah.
people drive along and everything's going fine, but when they don't pay any particular attention to anything. But when there's a crash everyone slows down. They want to see what happened. You know, they won't admit it, but I think they're almost hoping to see something more violent than that. They want to see a body or some indication of real trouble. And I mean, to some extent, it's despicable to have that inclination, and yet I think biologically it makes sense. You want to know about serious life-threatening events, and especially I think in our evolutionary past, whatever you were, whether you were a primate or non-human or non-primate or almost any critter, events that result in life and death situations are the ones you better pay attention to. And in that sense, I don't like it when I look out the window with a special interest when there's been potential carnage. But I do it just like most other people do.
I think on the flip side of that, right, of biophobia is this notion that, some people, when they learn about evolutionary psychology or biology, and then they actually become more, right, I don't know, despicable in their behavior. Right?
Yeah,
There are people on that side who are like, oh yeah, infidelity is natural. I'm going to be unfaithful, that sort of thing.
right. Yeah, I think that does happen. Again, I don't have any data for that. I wouldn't be at all surprised if it's true. My guess is that it is that many people are vulnerable to
Mhm.
exactly that sort of thing. And I think that makes it all the more important that as evolutionary biologists, we make it clear that we're describing the way that, to some extent, the way the natural world works. That doesn't mean that we're prescribing what
Mhm.
people should be like. I mean, all sorts of infanticide, for instance, very well established now in the natural world, um, in the animal world, and unfortunately, to some extent, among human beings as well, at least some. But the fact that infanticide is, quote, natural among many mammal species doesn't mean that it's a good thing. Certainly, it's not even a good thing for them, I suspect, although it's a good thing. Unfortunately, it's a good thing, that is to say, fitness enhancing, typically for the infanticidal, usually infanticidal male. That doesn't mean that it's a good thing ethically, or that it's a good thing, that human beings should emulate. And of course, most men are not infanticidal. Um, but in the natural animal world, when it does happen, almost always it enhances the fitness of the males involved, because what they're doing is they're killing the offspring of females who, and those offspring are not their own offspring. This is usually after a male's taken over a female troop, and the babies in question were fathered by someone else. Now, I don't think there's any right-minded, sane, sober human being who thinks that that's the way human beings ought to behave. Um, but to some extent, it's natural. And one of the things that's really unfortunate here is that it has been found that if you look at child abuse, child neglect, child abuse, and infanticide in humans, it is substantially more likely among non-biological males who take over, essentially, who marry someone who already has children. Now, the enormous majority of individuals under those circumstances do not abuse, neglect, or murder their stepchildren. In fact, I'm a stepfather, and I never murdered my stepchildren. I was angry with them sometimes. I was angry with my own biological children sometimes too. But so the great majority of us under that circumstances don't. But the fact that there is a biological connection is very troublesome. And it's one that, again, when we talk about such things as infanticide, I think we have a real obligation to make it clear, A, that certainly in the human case it's extremely rare, that B, the fact that it does happen in some cases, in fact, it's not uncommon among non-human animals, we need to make it very clear that that's not in any way a blueprint for how human beings ought to behave. There are lots of things in the natural world that are, quote, natural. That's why we call it the natural world, but that aren't worth emulating. In fact, that are very important that we don't emulate.
Well, I think if you're designing social policy, right, or you're designing an organization, it's helpful to understand what these propensities are, right? I mean, if you were to have a prior, perhaps that a man is more likely to engage in violence than a woman. I mean, this is going to inform your policy perhaps and help you to achieve the desired results more effectively. I mean, I think that the probably the biggest area in today's world where we see biophobia has to do with sex differences, and you have written extensively on sex differences. Um, you know, why is it so important, first of all, to understand sex differences, and why do you think this is such a controversial thing? Although I think in biology it's not controversial at all.
Well, I agree. Let's take the last thing you said first, which is to say it's really not controversial at all. Um, Certainly, the biological definition of maleness as opposed to female is very well known and universally among scientists understood, that males are the ones who produce sperm, females are the ones who produce eggs, and that's it. I mean, though it has nothing to do with external genitalia or anything like that. There are plenty of animals, many birds, for most, the overwhelming majority of birds have no external genitals, and yet we have no problem knowing what's a male and what's a female. Um, as a result, we now understand. As a
Certainly, if you're a
result,
farm, certainly if you're a farmer, it's helpful to understand the distinction. If you're raising livestock, it helps.
that's right. There's no question about it. I mean, I went to graduate school in Wisconsin, and it was not all that rare to hear about Farmer Jones who has been attacked or gored or killed by his bull. Virtually never by a cow. I mean, there is a real difference between bulls and cows, between males and females. In certainly among vertebrates, males are almost always more aggressive than females, and we understand, as evolutionary biologists, we understand why. That doesn't mean males should be more aggressive, of course. It just means that they are, and as a result of that, well, that's why farmers overwhelm, and not just farmers, but people who have dogs, for instance, will be, if they're responsible, they will have their males neutered. Be good to get females spayed as well, just if they're, because you don't want undesired pregnancies. But neutering males, and horses in particular, some dogs, uh, is because you dramatically reduce the aggressive inclinations of the males in question. Um, Now, in terms of the controversy of this issue, again, I think the reason male female differences have been controversial has to do with something similar to why biophobia in general has existed, which is to say that recognition has been used in the past as a way of buttressing social, uh, socially inappropriate distinctions. The notion that, well, men are more aggressive than women, men are more pushy than women, hence, men are likely to become leaders, business leaders, political leaders, and that's all well and good. That's normal. It's natural. There we're back again to the naturalistic fallacy, and so to some extent, that's, I think, a big part of the reason why male female differences have become not quite toxic as an issue, but really problematic. Um, Also, I think it's true that some of that difference has been exaggerated in the past, particularly with regard to intellectual abilities. I mean, for a very long time, up until quite recently, there was serious, unbelievable. There was serious debate whether women were capable of rational thought. I mean, this stuff is so bizarre when we look at it now. It's ridiculous, and yet that was the received wisdom by seemingly intelligent people up until really quite recently. Um, and so I think, again, that notion of male female differences as being somehow biological. Uh, Again, there are areas where it is. I mean, truth is, men occasionally, some men who are, particularly awful circumstances and quote awful people themselves rape women. Women virtually never rape men. I mean, there are real differences here, but to extend these differences to areas where they don't exist at all, for example, intellectual competence, has happened so much and has been so hurtful in the past that I think we need to understand, we meaning you and I and evolutionary biologists generally, need to understand why it is that that area has become a focus for so much concern, because to some extent the concern is legitimate. When male female differences are used as ways to legitimize a kind of inequality that has absolutely no basis otherwise, we need to oppose it.
Well, you talk about the biological tortoise and the cultural hare, right? And when culture moves so quickly and biology moves much more slowly, then this sometimes creates some tensions. You have a whole book on polygamy, which, I mean, you could have called the book book on reproductive skew, because I mean, I think that those two things are tied together. And even though we don't have a whole lot of polygamy in our world, we also, the reproductive skew is not nearly as severe as it was in the past. These things still have profound consequences for how we think and how we feel and how we interact with each other. I was wondering if you could talk just a bit about that. How does that still kind of shape the, not just sort of our mating habits, but also kind of how we interact with each other in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe it's worth explaining to the audience what reproductive skew is. It's a technical term that is really very important, and you put your finger on it. appropriately. Um, Essentially, what we're talking about here is if you look at, when I say the variance, again, we're making it a technical term, but if you're looking at the degree of statistic of spread in terms of reproductive success, say, of men versus women, we find that there's a significant difference in that, certainly historically, um, in that women tend to vary relatively little from one woman to the next in terms of their reproductive success, the number of offspring, whereas men tend to have a much greater skew, a much greater difference. There are many more men who have no children, and in the past, at least, up until fairly recently in our evolutionary history, um, a relatively small number of men who had a very, very large number of offspring. Genghis Khan is sort of a classic example. It's estimated now that something like 15% of human population, most of which, of course, are in Asia, but have are descendants of Genghis Khan, which is an extraordinary thought. Um, Now, this derives from the very long-standing history of polygyny in our evolutionary past, by which we're not very different from the great majority of mammals. That is to say, a situation where in our evolutionary history, um, a small number of males, or if you look at an individual reproductive unit, would typically consist of one male and a number of females. That would mean that at the same time, there would be um, a fairly large number of males who were non-reproductive. That's, again, you have this significant reproductive skew. And this was because one male, by virtue of producing many sperms, capable of inseminating many females, and that in turn resulted and still does in most species a high degree of male-male competition. Those that succeed wind up with a large number of, quote, mates or wives, if you want, and those that fail are sort of left out bachelors, and those bachelors are unsuccessful. Now, that in turn, that differential pressure whereby most females would have at least one offspring, whereas most males would have no offspring and a small number would have a large number, that resulted in a high level of competition among the males. And as a consequence of that, males in general, among many mammals, not all, but many mammals, including most non-human primates, really, and including almost certainly our ancestors, resulted in what we call sexual dimorphism, with significant differences between males and females. Males tend to be bigger than females. Not every male is bigger than every female, but on balance, statistically, they are. They also tend to be more violent, more aggressive. Um, and so these differences are real. Are they good? No, I don't see anything good about them, but they're very much part of our human ancestry.
We've more or less introduced a system of monogamy for a good couple thousand years, certainly in the West, and so with some exceptions, that's been the rule, and so and that's been, I think, tremendously impactful in terms of reducing things like, I don't know, perceived inequality with respect to reproduction, and certainly it's had what, I don't know if you're allowed to use this term, like a civilizing influence to some extent, right? But it's still the underlying biological impulses still kind of rear their heads in various ways, right? In terms of status competition and violence and these other differences which persist.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, it's only really quite recently that monogamy has been imposed, if you will, by our sort of Judeo-Christian ethic. Uh, Up until the essentially the mid 19th century, um, it was quite clear to anthropologists that roughly 85% of the human population experienced polygyny, not monogamy. Monogamy was true for maybe 10-12% of the population. And even now, I should add, polygyny, harem formation is still widespread in significant parts of Africa. Um, and I'm not clear. I wouldn't even say that it's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It's a thing. But I think we tend to think of the West as being the way human beings, quote, naturally are. But I think to a large extent that's been imposed. Um, I'm not in favor of polygyny. I'm very happily married, monogamously so. Um, but I don't think that's necessarily part of our biology. In fact, I think to be monogamously mated, for whether male or female, requires to some extent going against our biology. Um, yeah, it's more obviously true for males because of our historical propensity for polygyny. It's also, to an extent that's only recently become to be appreciated, true for females too, because even in polygynous species, it was not uncommon for females to look for sexual mates outside of their, quote, normal traditional network. Um, as biologists, we had a hard time recognizing this, in part because I think most biologists were males and they didn't want to see this on the part of females. They were more likely to witness males, beating up other males and looking for other additional female mates, and to almost with a mild chuckle, write this down and record it, take data. When it came to female, and this was more visible. I mean, the males weren't hiding what they were doing, and as biologists watching it, we observed it. It was consistent with what we believed theoretically to be the case, and was the case. At the same time, females were doing something like this. They weren't so much beating up other females, although there are more cases of that than we acknowledged at the time. But they would, in fact, go out of their way often, again, depending on the species and the situation, to obtain additional mateships. But they did so in a way that was, quote, sneaky. Not because there's something evil about them that makes them sneaky, but because the males, their male, quote, their males, I'm putting that in air quotes now, were likely to be very intolerant of that behavior, and for understandable evolutionary reasons. They don't want to be cuckolded, if you will, by their females. So the females in question then, and almost every species that did this, that looked for mates, sexual couplings outside of the normally visible mateships, um, those females would do so on the sly. When the males weren't watching, they were very good at hiding what they were doing, not just from their males, but from us biologists who were watching and studying them. So it's only really with the advent of DNA fingerprinting that we became aware of what was going on, not just by the males, but by the females. Because when we did DNA on offspring, we found to an astounding degree, even among birds, which were most bird species up until maybe the early 90s when DNA fingerprinting became widespread, were it was sort of taken as received wisdom that they were monogamous. They looked monogamous, they engaged in social monogamy, but when you looked at the DNA of the offspring, not uncommonly, depending on the species, 10, 15, 20, in some species up to 60%, 70% actually, in a certain bird species, were fathered by someone else other than the social partner of the female. So, in any case, what I'm getting at is that sexual peccadillos, if you will, are not really peccadillos. They're part of the biological inheritance of most living things, and human beings are not excluded from this. And so that means that monogamy is a challenging enterprise. And in fact, you mentioned some of my books. One of the books that I wrote, co-authored with my wife, is The Myth of Monogamy, looking at that the whole notion of monogamy as natural and easy is itself a myth. That doesn't mean it isn't good. Again, we're back to the naturalistic fallacy here. But if you want to be monogamous, you need to acknowledge that you're going to have to work at it. And this is consistent, right, with one of the points you made earlier about the value of, if you're going to help people be knowledgeable about their own evolutionary biology, or that rather it's important for them to be knowledgeable about their own evolutionary biology and recognize what their own inclinations are likely to be, so that they're not, what's the word I'm looking for, sort of hit from the side, surprised, astounded when they find themselves, whether male or female, looking more than once at someone other than their official mate. This is natural. This is what's going to happen. It doesn't mean you have to act on it, but if you're unaware and unexpected, if you don't expect this sort of thing, then I suspect then that you're likely to think, oh my God, either there's something wrong with me, I'm a bad person, or I'm not affiliated with the right person for me, or else I wouldn't be looking twice at somebody else. Whereas, in fact, I think the appropriate response under those circumstances is, number one, congratulations. Yes, you're a healthy human being. You find other people sexually attractive, and two, you need to acknowledge that that's a normal thing. And then the question is, what do you want to do about it?
Well, so look, this is like having a user's manual, right? If you can take driving lessons and learn how to drive a car, but you also want to get someone and say, hey, this thing has a tendency to do this. The steering has a tendency to drift you off the highway and stuff. And if you don't know about those tendencies, then you're probably going to find it more difficult to implement those instructions that you've gotten from the
That's a
driving
very good
lessons.
metaphor. Yes. Or the accelerator pedal. If you floor the accelerator, your car is going to go really, really fast. That doesn't mean that that's what you ought to do. It's designed to do that. Yes, that's part of its design feature. But the user's manual would say, just because you can floor the accelerator doesn't mean you should. Right.
Right. Well, that example you just talked about, right? Infidelity and mate guarding and so forth. I mean, that's an arms race. And you talk a lot about arms races in your books. I mean, you talk about deception and efforts to detect deception. And I think in one of those books, you said that there was a time in biology where animal communication was thought of as something which was always striving towards accuracy or transparency, that you wanted to kind of communicate something truthfully. I mean, is that true? Was there ever a moment where anybody actually believed that? That seems puzzling. I mean, as an
Oh,
economist, there's also people who believe, perfect information is always good, but we all know as economists that deception is definitely part of every actor's playbook.
right. It is. But in fact, biologists absolutely, up until really fairly recently, um, completely believed and taught. I can remember being taught when looking at the biology of animal courtship, for instance. I mean, it was well known that males are the ones who are the more vigorous courters. They do a whole lot as part of courtship, singing, dancing, whatever, showing off. And the explanation for what were they doing, well, why were they doing it? Well, a number of things. One is they're conveying what species they are, and that's true. They're conveying what sex they are, and that's true. Um, and they're to some extent conveying their quality, and that to some extent now we know to be true. But that was it, that they were accurately conveying a situation, and that was thought to be true of animal communication generally. Um, and then really wasn't until the late 60s, 1970s, that
The
people
Trivers,
began
right?
to
Is
think.
Trivers the sort of pioneer in that area?
Rivers to some extent, and Richard Dawkins even more so, actually.
Yeah.
Um, um, Richard Dawkins wrote a now classic paper with one of his colleagues, whose name I am unfortunately I am blocking at the moment, where they basically pointed out that animal communication can provide accurate information, but that there is not necessarily a payoff for sending information that's accurate. Rather, there's a payoff for sending information that conveys a benefit to the sender if it is believed by the receiver. And that's really the purpose of communication. Sending information not because it's accurate information, but essentially that there is really no difference between sending information and manipulating. That one sends information in order to influence the behavior of the one who receives it. Sometimes that's accurate information. If a honeybee goes out and finds a good food source, for instance, there's really no motivation for that worker to come back and mislead her colony mates. Um, it's really one for all and all for one when it comes to that kind of thing. But when it comes to an individual, let's say, who's trying to convince a potential mate that that female usually should mate with him, the, clearly they want to indicate the species and the gender, the sex. But even more so, they want to persuade. When you're persuading, you send whatever information you can that will be persuasive. And there's absolutely no
Marketing.
reason why it shouldn't involve exaggerating. I'm sorry?
It's marketing,
The
right?
marketing, there you
Puffery.
go. Yep, yep. And if you can, whatever you can do to persuade the receiver to behave in a way that benefits you, selection will favor doing that. And that's,
Mhm.
that now is increasingly recognized as true. But true that animals will often be deceitful. Um, but yeah, up until very recently, that was not the received wisdom.
Now, you've also written a book on game theory. Of course, the big concern has to do with cooperation, right? And normally when we're trying to inspire cooperation, it's important to have some kind of punishment or deterrence. I mean, that's integral to understanding cooperation. But in your book, Threats, you say that we are overinvested in deterrence. I mean, humans spend too much time thinking about deterrence. We invest too many resources in deterrence. And why is that so? I mean, isn't deterrence absolutely essential to preserve cooperation?
To a large extent, yes, I think it absolutely is. There needs to be consequences of defection in the game theoretic sense. Um, and so I really don't argue against deterrence as such. I think deterrence is really important. It's very important that we not only maintain that option as a way of maintaining cooperation, as you just said so well, but even in our regular daily lives. I mean, up until recently, when I moved to California from our horse farm outside of Seattle, we had a 10-acre horse farm, and we had a particularly large and rather intimidating dog who would patrol the fences, our electric fence. And he was a deterrent. He was a very effective deterrent, and we were aware he was a deterrent, and we loved him. We loved him in his own right, but we loved him for it as well. We also had that fence he was protecting was an electric fence as well. Keep the horses in and to keep intruding, particularly uh, mountain lions, actually, and coyotes out. So I certainly believe in deterrence. What I don't, and even to some extent, increasingly with regard to the military, I believe in conventional deterrence to a very large extent. Not completely. I think we've overdone that, but I think that is necessary to a degree. Where I particularly take issue, what I particularly take issue with, is nuclear deterrence, because I think the reliance on nuclear weapons as a way of deterring has been, in fact, an enormous blunder. I mean, if our dog Candor should misfire when he was protecting our property, and he did misfire a few times actually, he wound up attacking a neighbor dog who unfortunately got through the electric fence, and that was very unfortunate for the neighbor dog. Um, but it didn't blow up the neighborhood, and the injuries were really quite limited. If deterrence should fail, and our reliance on nuclear weapons is very much connected to our reliance on it for deterrence, we wouldn't be around tisk-tisking about, oh, how unfortunate deterrence didn't work in this case. And because I think that nuclear deterrence carries with it a whole array of enormous dangers that undermine itself and that, in fact, make the world much, much more dangerous than it would be otherwise.
Mhm.
So my objection to deterrence is highly qualified, if you will. I think it's particularly unfortunate when applied to nuclear weapons, and it's become really the primary popular justification for maintaining nuclear weapons. And I think that's really regrettable.
But you also talk about how difficult it is to actually make credible threats, right? I mean, that's always the challenge. Anybody can make threats, right? But one doesn't necessarily have an incentive to follow through on it. I mean, I guess we would hope that that's the case when it comes to nuclear deterrence, that it's really all a matter of bluffing, right? And that people will ultimately realize that it's not a good idea to follow through on those threats, right? I mean, is the problem more like lack of credibility of these threats of retaliation or deterrence, or is it that people might actually follow through on these threats? I mean, if it was really credible and people believed in it, then you'd never have to use it, right? I mean, it's almost like it's more likely to happen when it's not credible than when it is credible.
Well, you're absolutely right. One of the big problems with nuclear deterrence is its reliance on credibility. There are other problems as well, independent of that, though. But we could talk a little bit. Let's talk a little bit now about that issue of credibility, because that's one of the major factors that actually undermines nuclear deterrence and makes it as dangerous as it now is. Because the use of nuclear weapons is itself incredible, because the consequence of their use would be so disastrous, not only upon the victim, but upon the initial attacker, even if there's no retaliation just because of nuclear winter, which has been increasingly demonstrated to be absolutely valid, by the way. The consequences of using nuclear weapons on a large scale, and the result, the fact that even use on a small scale would very rapidly magnify into large-scale use by almost any war games criteria. The result of all this is that the use of nuclear weapons themselves lacks credibility. It's like as though you were to say to your child, I use this as a metaphor in at least one of my books. You say, "All right, Joey, eat your spinach," and he says, "Well, I don't want it. What if I don't?" And I say, "Well, if you don't eat your spinach, I'm going to blow up the house." Well, I mean, that's not a very credible. You could say, if you don't eat your spinach, you're not going to be able to watch your favorite movie, or you don't get dessert. That would be credible. Saying you're going to blow up the house is it's not only not good child rearing, but it's not going to be credible. In the nuclear realm, in the realm of nuclear strategy, that problem of credibility is a huge one. And in fact, it's actually one of the things that catapulted Henry Kissinger to major notoriety. He pointed out the particular problem of the lack of credibility with the use of the threat of the use of nuclear weapons in Europe. And so in order to counter that lack of credibility, what happened was and he recommended this, and it was done, was the development of so-called tactical nuclear weapons, small and more usable nuclear weapons. They would be more credible. And in fact, they would be more credible. Big problem here is that it's kind of like the old-fashioned Chinese finger puzzle. The more you pull to get out, the worse things get. Because the solution to that solution to the problem of nuclear weapons use being incredible is to make their use more credible. Now, the only way you can make their use more credible in this situation, the scenario, make them smaller, and hence what? More usable. So the answer to making them more credible is to make them more usable. You make something more usable, it's more likely to be used. And so that's the Chinese finger puzzle problem. In order to get around that problem of incredibility, you have to make them more credible. The only way you can make them more credible is to make them more usable and hence more likely to be used. And by every scenario that has any, quote, credibility, the more they're used, the more likely is that problem to escalate. So credibility itself is a huge problem undermining deterrence. But it's not the only one. There are the problems that deterrence relies on a kind of rationality. And economists have become increasingly of late come to recognize that human beings are not nearly as rational as they like to assume that human beings are. You cannot assume, as nuclear deterrence does, that in a situation of maximum crisis you can scare the pants off your would-be opponents scare the hell out of them, and then expect them to behave with exquisite rationality. So that's yet another. And then there are accidents, there are false alarms, there are any number of problems. So credibility is a big one, but it's not the only thing. Um, Nuclear
Mhm.
deterrence, I really believe, is a major problem, and that's an understatement.
Yeah, and recent events in the Ukraine are making us wonder whether or not Putin's threats are bluffs or not. Let's hope they're bluffs. But
That's
I
right.
couldn't end without asking you about this book, Madame Bovary's Ovaries, right? Because as someone who loves literature and biology, I
Yeah.
found this to be interesting and entertaining. And I was wondering, what drew you to write this book with your daughter?
Well, I've always loved literature too, and my daughter Nellie, with whom I wrote it, also loves literature. She's a veterinarian now and a DVM PhD. She's very much a scientist, but she's also a literary advocate, and she has the benefit over me of being a natural-born speed reader. So she would be able to go through a vast library of major literature and help me point out the some of the examples we were looking for, which were essentially cases in which literature reflects evolutionary wisdom. Um, Fiction is not purely made up out of whole cloth. It is based, I think, really on human nature. If it's totally uh, regardless of basic human nature, no one is going to read it. There has to be, we talked about credibility, there has to be a degree of credibility in the way human beings are portrayed. And so what we did in that book is go through some of particularly the great works of literature and point out how, although they are artistically wonderful in their own right, for sure, they're not textbooks of human behavior, but they're more than that. They're wonderful artistically. Also, they are connected to fundamentally accurate
Mm.
insights about the nature of human nature, even though many of them were written long before Darwin, long before anyone knew about natural selection. But the basic evolutionary insights into human behavior are there, and they're reflected from the Iliad on. And so that's what we were pointing out in that book. And I agree that I hesitate to say this, but I honestly think probably the best thing about that book is the title. Madame Bovary's
Well,
ovaries. Everyone, yeah, you have to crack up. You have to smile when you hear
yeah, but it is kind of strange that that isn't a bigger movement. I mean, we've had Freudian literary criticism, we've had Marxist literary criticism, and yet, biological literary criticism is
hardly
is,
a
is
bit.
a pretty fringe movement, right?
Well, here I'd go back to the discussion we had earlier about the role, the siloing, if you will, of academic disciplines. Most people who study literature um, and go on to become professors of literature reflect what they had learned. And usually that's not evolutionary biology, unfortunately. That's right.
Mhm. Well, David, thanks so much for joining me. I won't recount the books all over again, but suffice it to say that there's a whole bunch of books, and they're all super interesting and amazingly well written. And I look forward to continued output. So thanks again.
Well, thank you, Greg. It's been a pleasure.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.